Hello and welcome to the Craft Beer Corner. For today's review, we've got one that doesn't come around but a handful of weeks. Most of the time during the year, there are a few you can get outside of season, but we've got a very exciting review for you today. Today we are going to be reviewing a couple of American craft interpretations of classic German Oktoberfest beers or Märzen style beers. So it's definitely time for you to dust off your lederhosen, brush up on your Deutsch, and get ready to slam some beers while you're talking to some bratwursts. Nonetheless, we've got a couple that are brewers that we've reviewed before, but I have never had either of these beers from either brewer. So we're going to be starting with Reuben's Brews. This is, they call it Festbier. This is a Märzen style Oktoberfest. Obviously the American version, it's an American craft interpretation. This one clocks in at 5.8% ABV. Reuben's Brews is based out of Seattle, Washington. And then number two, we are going to 903 Brewers Oktoberfest. This is 5.4% ABV, and they are based out of Sherman, Texas. So two Oktoberfest Märzen style beers brewed by two American craft brewers. So I'm always interested to see the American interpretations because typically we brew ours quite a bit differently than the Germans actually brew theirs for the fest. Ours tend to be a lot more malt-centric, a lot maltier and richer in that realm, whereas the Germans tend to be brewing much lighter beers for Oktoberfest for their own consumption and much hoppier. Indeed, the German import Oktoberfest by the vast majority of manufacturers, they make specific versions that they ship to us that are completely different than what they drink back in Germany. So always interesting to see the different American craft interpretations. So it's going to be really fun. I can't wait to jump in. So we're going to do just that. We're going to get started with the Reuben's Brews Festbier, Märzen Oktoberfest style beer. This one clocks in at 5.8% ABV. Okay, jumping right into our first beer of today's American craft Oktoberfest or Märzen beer review. We've got two, starting today with the Reuben's Brews. They call this one Festbier. That is aptly named, and they do spell it properly, B-I-E-R. I before E in German makes an E sound. E before I makes an I sound. Just a little bit of German knowledge for you. 5.8% ABV on this one out of Seattle, Washington. Now, I really like the design on this can. If you don't know that much about Oktoberfest, it's quite colorful. It's a very long festival. It's been running for a very, very long time. And the Germans do indeed take it very seriously, particularly those in Bavaria and in München in particular. That's Munich, Bavaria being a state of Germany that is kind of the heart of Oktoberfest. But these are some of the color schemes that you will see over there. There's different ones, but this one's very common on a lot of the flags and the coloring of the festival. Looks awesome. I really like this can art. It really puts me in mind. And indeed, even the font that they used on here looks very similar to a lot of the fonts that are used at Oktoberfest proper, and that is October with a K. Let's get this cracked. There it is. All right. This one poured into one of my really great all-purpose glasses. Now right away I can tell you that this looks a lot more akin to a classic German Oktoberfest beer that they would brew for their own consumption than the vast majority of ones that are imported over here or that many craft beer brewers actually brew. They tend to be a lot lighter. Maybe not even that much different in hue to, say, a classic German Pilsner or a Helles. Visually, this is a beautiful beer. It is absolutely crystal clear. It is lighter than the average American craft Oktoberfest interpretation, though it does definitely still have an amberish hue. It's still a bit darker than the average German offering, but it looks great. Formed an absolutely lush, beautiful, creamy head. Looking at the carbonation in here, it basically did all its work when it created the head, and now there's just a couple fine beads. I would say they're kind of small to medium small in size, but it looks absolutely lovely, stunningly beautiful beer. It really is lovely to look at the glass. It's just so clear. I mean, that just looks absolutely pure. That is a clean looking beer. Let's give this a sniff. That smells fantastic. I'll tell you, aroma-wise, it reminds me of a cross between a classic German brewed Oktoberfest and a classic German brewed Pilsner. That's what this smells like, kind of like somewhere in the middle between the two. It's got a very similar malt aroma to it, and there's a little hop presence to it. So I'm honestly not even sure what to expect here. Maybe this is one of the American craft interpretations that brews more like the Germans brew for themselves. I like them all, but I do have a personal preference. But nonetheless, let's jump in and see what this one's about. Head is settled. It's still holding strong, though. It looks great. Oh, that's a very tasty beer. That's very well done. Okay. This 100% is one of the American versions that falls a heck of a lot more in line with how the Germans brew Oktoberfest beers for themselves. It's still a little maltier, but it's got enough hop presence that it takes some of that malt intensity out and still lets the bitters have a voice in the beer. You don't get that in all of them, and they're all a bit different. This actually puts me in mind of probably Spaten Oktoberfest would be the closest that I could think. It's got a little more hoppy kick to it than you'll find in many American Oktoberfest interpretations. And it's really neither for better or for worse. I mean, even the Germans brew them differently for us, and they're brewing it, and it's still, by all accounts, a Märzen beer they were drinking. It's just not what they drink at the festival themselves. But this is really a nice beer. This is very well done. It's so clean. And it really does remind me, the aroma that I detected is, it comes through in the flavor. It reminds me of a hybrid somewhere between a German Oktoberfest and a German Pilsner. It's kind of splitting in the middle. That's what this comes off as, and that is a very high compliment. It's quite tasty. Body is a nice full medium. It's a full medium. It's got a very nice body. The mouthfeel is super smooth. And you roll it around the palate and it does get very creamy. Not dissimilar to how a Pilsner feels in the mouth. Difference being there's no notable dryness on the end of this. This is a wet beer. I wouldn't say it's viscous, but it does cream up and add some thickness when it rolls around the palate. If you just leave it flat and swallow without rolling around the palate, it just feels like a normal beer. Nice, normal, clean beer. It's not super active. It just feels like beer. Very nice. The finish is not ridiculously long, but there's enough lingering bitters that kind of pair with the malt and help extend it a little longer than I actually did anticipate. It's not as long as on most German Oktoberfest beers. They have quite a bit bigger hoppy kick, and those bitters tend to linger around a bit longer. Malt gets lost quite easily on the back end of any sip of beer. The finishes in general don't last as long. Hops are a very good way to do it. Now, if we're talking high ABV beers like imperial stouts, porters, etc., certainly even without tons of hops, those just have so much more into them, the flavor is going to linger around a bit. But 5.8, and that's actually probably a little higher than your average Oktoberfest, certainly than a German Oktoberfest, but it's very nice. It doesn't feel heavy, it feels very refreshing, and the aroma and the flavor, everything about this beer screams to me Oktoberfest. It 100% puts me in mind of Oktoberfest and gets me in the mood to celebrate it, which I think is what you should be going for if that's what you're going to try to do. I think this is a very nice, true to style interpretation of what an Oktoberfest beer is. I think that Reuben's Brews nailed it with this. I truly do. It's fantastic. I really enjoy this. First get it in your mouth, you get that malty sweetness. There's a little honey-like quality to it and a little carameliness to it. And it's not super pungent. It's just a very delicious kind of flavor out of the malts. And then the bitters kind of come in the back. And they're not oppressive. It's not even as pungent and forward as you would find on an average German Pilsner, but they're there and they balance out the malt. So it's not so oppressively malty. It's a ridiculously well-balanced beer. I think they struck the right balance. They used the right ingredients and they just executed it masterfully. I absolutely love this beer. I'm going to take my absolute time sipping on this beauty. I'm going to come up with my scores, and when we come back, we will get to 903 Brewers Oktoberfest. That one clocks in at 5.4% ABV. Okay, so jumping into the second beer of today's Märzen or Oktoberfest beer review, we have got 903 Brewers Oktoberfest, aptly named. This one clocks in slightly lower ABV than the prior. This one's 5.4%, and 903 Brewers is based out of Sherman, Texas. Label art is pretty neat. It's got Prost on the side, which is the German word for cheers. That's what they say when they salute one another drinking. It says Oktoberfest. It's got kind of a German theme and script on there. It looks really neat. I like it. And certainly the kind of pattern on here and the font that they used looks very, very Germanic and Oktoberfest festive. So I'm a big fan. Looks great. I like the can art. Let's get this cracked gently. It's a can. My cans have a tendency on me to get a little overzealous and want to spill all over my table. Okay, we're in good shape. All right, let's get this one poured. Okay, right away, this one definitely looks a bit darker than the prior. Not a ludicrous amount, but enough that it's certainly noticeable. So I'm going to guess that this one's going to be maybe a bit more malt forward in character than hop forward, which again is okay. It's not how the Germans overall brew for themselves, but it is very much akin to how American craft brewers brew the style, and certainly is how the majority of German brewers brew the style that they import to us. We get a different version than they consume at the actual festival themselves. All right, visually, it's beautiful. It's definitely darker than the prior. This has a notable caramel hue to it. It is very caramelly ambery in appearance. You might want to call it orange. It looks great though. Head formed okay. They're only 12 ounces in this glass. Just the shape of it, I really would have to be far more aggressive out of the gate, but I didn't want to risk making a ridiculous head on it, but that's all right. There's normally a head on one, but it's, you know, it's not the end of the world. Carbonation wise, it looks like it's not super duper active coming out of the bottom, but what I do see is mostly medium-sized bubbles. Let's give it a sniff. Absolutely, this smells significantly more malt forward than the prior. Indeed, I can't really pick up any hops on this. It is predominantly malt that I'm detecting. It smells very nice. It smells very much like a classic Märzen malt bill. So I'm certainly looking forward to jumping in. So we're going to do that right now. Let's jump right in, have a sip. Yeah, absolutely. That's a very nice beer. It tastes very good. It's very clean, very refreshing, and it is very, very malt forward. Really, there is the slightest hint of a bitter undertone, but the hops don't really come through at all in aroma, and there's no noticeable hop flavor really except on the very, very back end. It is malt dominant. It's not overtly malty. There are some Oktoberfest beers that are far more malt intense, even with lower ABVs than this. I would say it's balanced, but this one is certainly a malt forward interpretation of a Märzen style beer versus a more hoppy interpretation, but it's very nice. Tastes quite good. I'm going to jump in for another sip here, explore body, mouthfeel, finish, and balance. Body on this one is medium, exactly where I expect for the ABV. Feels quite nice in the mouth. Mouthfeel is exactly what I expect from an Oktoberfest. It's not particularly thick, but it's thicker than you might expect considering the ABV, but it feels right for an Oktoberfest Märzen style in your mouth. If you do start to agitate it around the palate, it does get quite creamy, and that really thickens it up. In terms of flavor development, it's got that malty sweetness up front, and then the malt flavor, as soon as you swallow, really intensifies, significantly intensifies. And it's very much a mix of kind of a classic Märzen malt flavor characteristic paired with more caramelly. But the caramel isn't overdone. It's behind the classic Oktoberfest, which is a good way to balance it out in my opinion. If you take the more caramelly sided malts, they tend to overshadow and kind of make the flavor go in a direction that's not really right for the style. Really, if we're talking Märzen for the purpose of Oktoberfest, it doesn't typically come out quite as caramel forward. So I think the balance on this is very, very well done. That said, that's in terms of a malt forward Oktoberfest interpretation. Personally, I like them all. I'm not a hater, but my preference is to be closer to how the Germans brew it for themselves. Have a little more hop bite. And it's not intense. We're not talking pale ale IPA here. Really much more in line to say that same bite as your average German Pilsner. It's got a noticeable hop presence and hop bite, even though it's still a malty beer style. This is a very well done example. I enjoy this very much. I'm going to have one more sip for final thoughts. Very, very grainy up front. Very cereal-like, very grainy. That's that classic Märzen malt characteristic that's riding the front. And then that caramel sweetness is behind it. But that grain forward, that cereal edge is what's dominant on front. And I think that's what really helps balance this out right for me for the style in a malt forward Oktoberfest. That's what I want to see. That's the balance, what they did here. This is a very, very good example. Oktoberfest Märzen style beers, they do have quite a bit of leeway in how they're presented, and they're all still perfectly fine examples of the style. Everybody has their own preference, but this is very, very well done. I'm going to take my time, sip on this, come up with my scores. When we come back, we will get both beers ranked from top to bottom. Okay, now that we've gotten to enjoy both of these beers, we're going to get them ranked, starting with the Reuben's Brews Festbier. Again, both of these are Märzen style, or more commonly called Oktoberfest beers. The style is called Märzen. 5.8% ABV on this one. They are based out of Seattle, Washington. Starting with the aroma. The aroma on this beer was very, very nice, and it was quite pronounced. You could get the classic Märzen malt bill underneath, but you could also detect that this one was going to have a little more hop forward character to it. In fact, the aroma really did put me in mind of my absolute favorite German Oktoberfest beer, which is Spaten. This was fantastic. Only 1 point shy, I thought, of the intensity of the perfect Märzen. It gets a 9. Taste. This was really, really well done. Honestly, as an American craft example of a Märzen style, they run the gamut. But this was probably among the closest, if not hands down the closest, example I've ever tried that mimics the actual German way of brewing a Märzen, how they brew it for themselves. I thought it was fantastic. I would have liked still just a little bit more of a hoppy bite, but it didn't miss the mark by much. I only docked 1 point. I give it a 9. Body on this was perfect for a Märzen. It was textbook. It gets a 10. Mouthfeel, same thing. They really nailed it. The malt bill that went into this was clearly right on the money. Even though the ABV on this one maybe is on the high end for a Märzen, kind of mid-high. It's not outlandish, but pushing 6%. They don't normally run quite that high. It still had the right body and the right viscosity, and the right texture and feel in the mouth. It gets a 10. Finish on this. Märzens don't tend to have the longest finish. Some of the more hop forward ones will be a bit more sustained because the bitters tend to linger. This one I was a little surprised because it had a very good balance of the malts and it did have a hoppier edge to it. And I was surprised that the finish didn't stick around any longer than it did. It was just average. It gets a 5. Head and retention on this beer was beautiful. It looked like it could have been poured in München straight off the tap. It gets a perfect 10 out of 10. Appearance-wise, this was a very, very nice looking beer. The actual German Oktoberfest beers that they brew for themselves are significantly lighter than what we are used to seeing over here. They don't brew the more roasty, malty edged. They tend to be lighter in appearance, not dissimilar to that of a German Pilsner. This was pretty close, but it was still a little darker than an actual Märzen, but I only docked 1 point. I gave it a 9. Balance, this was a beautifully balanced beer. I absolutely loved it. Really, for me, the only thing that I could say to make it absolute gold, just even a bit more hops to get just a little stronger bite that you don't have to just wait to the end to experience. I only docked 1 point. I gave it a 9. Feeling intangible, subjectively, I loved it. I really, really did. For me, it's only losing 1 point, and again, it is from the hops. I am a Märzen purist. I prefer the German traditional brewing offerings. I enjoy that Americans, have their own interpretation, but I do think, being true to the style is kind of important for this one. It gets a 9 out of 10. Finally, as an example of the style, from an American craft brewer, I don't know how much better it gets than this. I've had many. This, I do sincerely think is the best example I've had. But for me still, I had to dock a point just for a few categories, really. Okay, I nitpicked a few and docked a point in a few categories. Not that big of an impact overall for an example. But where it really matters is the length of the finish, and that really comes down to the hop intensity. It would have extended it. So it does get a 9, and that brings the total score on Reuben's Brews Festbier to an 89 out of 100. Very well above average. Definitely worth seeking. If you're a fan of Märzen style beers, I highly, highly recommend this one. I can't recall the last time I enjoyed an American craft Märzen as well as this one. It's high up on my list. Moving on to beer number 2. This is 903 Brewers Oktoberfest. Slightly lower ABV, 5.4%. They're based out of Sherman, Texas. The aroma on this beer was pronounced, quite pronounced. Certainly well above average. Not quite as pronounced on this one, but it was pronounced. You knew it was going to be malty and a grain-based and grain-forward versus kind of a hop mix or hop-intense Märzen. I knew that up front just from the aroma. It smelled great. It just lacked a little intensity for me, but not by much. I only docked 2 points. I gave it an 8. Moving on to the taste. I really enjoyed this. Märzen beers can run the gamut. They really can, especially the American craft interpretations, and they're all still technically Märzen style beers. For me, the taste on this was very nice, but the virtually complete absence of any bitters until the absolute end of the beer, for me, that's it's not exactly what I'm looking for. The malt forward characteristics were fantastic. I think what they did with the malt bill was absolutely delicious. It was very grain forward. It tasted grainy. It tasted cereally. There was a little caramel undertone, but it didn't overpower the actual base Märzen style grain bill. It was just missing the hop bite. I only docked 2 points though because I really did think it was delicious. I gave it an 8 out of 10. Body, just as with the first, it was exactly what I expected. Textbook, it gets a 10. Mouthfeel, same thing. It's exactly what I expected. These were both textbook examples of a Märzen body and mouthfeel. It gets a 10 out of 10. Finish on this one. Actually, this is where I thought that this might fall in a line. As soon as I smelled it and then tasted it, I said, okay, not much hints on the bitter. It's very malt forward. It's not going to have that much staying power. I was right. It just average, it gets a 5, which is where I expected this one, but not that one. They did get the same score in that category. Head retention. This one really didn't form a head at all. I mean, it kind of sort of tried, and then within seconds it was gone. Oktoberfest beers do form a nice head. This one did not do so. I only gave it a 2. Moving on to the appearance, this was really in line with how most American craft brewers brew the Märzen style, but it isn't the traditional color. It was significantly darker. Still within range, and certainly for an American brewer, so I didn't want to go bonkers in docking points, but just make a note that this is significantly darker than you're going to see if you actually got a Märzen in Germany. 7 out of 10 for the appearance. Moving on to the balance. Very nice beer. I enjoyed the balance of the grain bill, but again for me, the almost complete lack of a hop bite and a hop presence, I had to take some points off. I didn't take off that many because I still thought it was a really, really well done beer. And frankly, how they balanced the grains, knowing that they were making a malt-centric Märzen interpretation, they really did nail. Above average, it gets a 7. Feeling in the intangible, same thing here. I thought it was above average. I did take some points off, and there were some key points it was missing, but I really did overall enjoy the beer. I did think it was above average. It gets a 7. Finally, as an example of the style. I did take points off in many categories. Some of them were significant, but I'm going to come back to this. Especially when I'm thinking in terms of an American craft interpretation of a Märzen, I have to give a little bit more leeway. We haven't been brewing these for hundreds and hundreds of years. This is very much a German beer style that is part of their culture, and we started, coming up with our own interpretations. Some of them swing the gamut far out of the realm of what a German would brew, but it's the same spirit that's there. And frankly, I still thought this was an absolutely delicious beer, and I do overall think it's a very good example of the variances within the style, and I think it's well worth sinking. Above average, it gets a 7 here as well. That brings the total score on 903 Brewers Oktoberfest to a 71 out of 100. So we're looking at an 18-point spread here. That seems pretty big, and indeed it is, but these both are above average beers. I would say this one is getting very much into the upper echelon realm, and this is one certainly not to be overlooked. I also think that these beers maybe cater to completely different palates. Even in Germany, different brewers brew their Märzens differently, to cater to different tastes as well. There's not quite as wild of a swing of variance as we have in America when we brew them, but they do cater to different palates. This one's more hop forward, more hop dominant, more in line with the classic traditional German Märzen. This is much more in line with an extremely well executed malt-centric American interpretation. So it really just depends on what you like. A little something for everybody. Folks, that's today's review. As always, I do sincerely appreciate you tuning in today. Please don't forget to like, comment, subscribe. And if you want to keep in the loop when our videos go live to YouTube, you click the notification bell icon. It is right next to the subscribe button. Until next time, keep your beer, keep your craft. We'll see you on the next one. Prost.